17 million people watched, and in one sentence, everything exploded when Jasmine Crockett stood up to Vice President JD Vance over brutal cuts to Medicaid. She didn't expect to be mocked, humiliated, and reduced to a punchline on live TV. But just 48 hours later, she filed a $100 million lawsuit that would shake the White House, the courtroom, and the country's conscience in a showdown where power met precision, a hidden mic. And one sentence turned the tide. What did JD Vance say? That shattered everything he built. Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The hearing room was a fortress of formality columns carved from white stone, the seal of Congress looming behind the dais, and every camera lens trained forward. Like a loaded weapon, 17 million Americans were watching live. Jasmine Crockett stood behind a mic flanked by binders, and a thick manila folder marked emergency Medicaid impactor. Voice was calm, but her words cracked like glass. These cuts will strip health care from over 12 million low-income children. They won't vanish from your charts. They'll show up in yards with untreated infections and broken bodies. Behind her staffers shifted uncomfortably. She held up a CDC graph, red bars, climbing like a scream. This isn't about fiscal efficiency. It's about who gets to survive and who gets left behind. Her gaze was steady, unwavering, even as murmurs broke out across the Republican aisle. Then came J.D. Vance, the Vice President of the United States, pressed into a charcoal suit, adjusting his microphone. Without even glancing up the budget, he said with that signature drawl, "It is not a place for sob stories, gasps scattered like shrapnel." Vance didn't blink. "We're not here to fund trauma narratives. We're here to fix the system." He leaned forward, lips twitching in a practiced smirk. "And frankly, Congresswoman, the government is not your therapy couch." A few aides snickered behind their shoulders. Jasmine didn't move, but the look in her eyes turned to stone. The insult hadn't just dismissed her data, it had weaponized her compassion. As if on cue, Vance delivered the blow. He clearly rehearsed. These so-called support programs are nothing more than a financial clown show, an emotional stunt by a party allergic to numbers and addicted to crisis. The words echoed through the chamber like a backhand. One senator mouthed, "Did he just say that?" Others scribbled furiously, reporters tapping their keyboards like machine guns. Vance sat back, proud. The moment felt scripted, but deadly real. He had just framed health care for children as a circus act, and Jasmine Crockett, the only black woman at that bench, had just been cast as the ringmaster of government excess. And outside those walls, the internet caught fire. Twitter users resurfaced old clips of J.D. Vance from 2022, where he sneered that childless women were cat ladies who pushed handouts because they didn't understand real responsibility. That clip was now stitched side by side with today's footage of Vice President calling poor children's health care clowns. Show a storm was coming. Jasmine Crockett was still standing, but the tremor had begun, and it wasn't her voice shaking, it was a system. And yet, just when the room thought it had heard the worst, Jasmine Crockett calmly flipped to the next page, and her fold of the tremor in the chamber hadn't peaked. It was only beginning. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to the weight of what she carried to the lifting. Jasmine held up a printed report from the Urban Institute, the thick paper rigid in her gloved hands, its contents highlighted in the kind of angry red only pain could produce. This report, she began, her voice slow and precise like the tightening of a noose, projects that over 12 million children across this country will lose their health insurance if this budget passes. Her eyes moved deliberately, locking with senators from red states, Mississippi, Arkansas, West Virginia, states with the highest child poverty rates. "That's 12 million lives," she repeated, firmer. "Now reduce the collateral damage in a war against the poor." She let the words hang behind her. An LED screen flickered to life, illuminating a United States map, bathed in shades of red. The darker the color, the deeper the suffering. These are not projections created by activists or pundits. She continued, "They're verified, peer-reviewed, data-driven figures from one of the most respected, nonpartisan think tanks in the country." The chamber was quiet, but not peaceful. It was a silence of something about a crack. "This is not conjecture, this is impact." She said each word spaced like a drumbeat. Real measurable harm. Her hand trembled slightly as she tapped the report's binding, but her voice never did. In the seats behind her, an aide held back tears. Somewhere in the third row, a Republican senator slowly uncrossed his arms. Jasmine Crockett was not pleading. She was prosecuting, presenting evidence not of politics, but of consequence. "You can ignore me," she said, "but you will not ignore these numbers." And then across the long lacquered table, J.D. Vance exhaled and laughed. It started as a low, almost performative scoff, but grew louder, more deliberate, and more cruel. With every syllable, if their parents had real jobs, he said none of those kids would be losing insurance in the first place. The words detonated in the room like a nail bomb. Chairs shifted, mouths dropped. A reporter stopped typing the oxygen. Seemed to vanish. Crockett didn't respond right away. Her jaw tightened, but her spine didn't bend. She stared straight ahead like someone who had been preparing for this precise kind of violence her entire life. "What did you just say?" A female senator whispered, too shocked to control the volume. Others began murmuring, voices laced with disbelief and fury. The hum in the chamber turned into a static roar. One congressional aide put their head in their hands. Another recorded the moment on a hidden phone. Crockett said nothing, not yet, but her hands now, resting on the folder, gripped the edges like the wood beneath her might snap from the force. Vance leaned back, as if he just made a clever joke at a private dinner party. "This is what happens," he added smugly, "when a generation is taught that government is their father and the hospital is their inheritance." This time, there were no gasps, just stillness, the kind of stillness that comes after someone is slapped so hard it takes a moment to register the pain, the kind of stillness that is in itself a scream. It wasn't just dismissiveness anymore. It was a full-throated indictment of the poor, the working class, and everyone who has ever walked into a clinic with a Medicaid card. And a prayer. The cruelty wasn't passive. It was theatrical, designed not only to dismiss, but to humiliate. Crockett's breath slowed. Her face was still, but her silence was volcanic. You could see it behind her eyes, the rising of something vast and ancient and deadly calm. She didn't need to respond. The room had already turned. Lawmakers shifted uncomfortably. Even those who privately agreed with Vance avoided his gaze. And outside those walls, America began to speak back. Within minutes, Twitter exploded. JD Vance's 2021 Fox News interview resurfaced like a ghost kicking down the door. The clip played on loop. Vance sneering as he declared that poor Americans should be subject to what he called a laziness tax. To quote, "Maybe it's time we tax laziness instead of labor." Now, that same man had just claimed that children lose health care because their parents don't have real jobs. The connection was unmistakable. This wasn't a slip. It was a pattern, an ideology sharpened into a weapon and aimed at the vulnerable. In the hearing room, Jasmine Crockett remained standing. She didn't yell, she didn't cry, but she didn't sit down either. She held the Urban Institute report in her hand like a shield not made of steel, but of truth, and for a moment it was stronger than anything power could muster. The war had begun not over numbers, but over what it meant to be seen as human. The silence that followed wasn't a calm after a storm, it was the inhale before the next explosion. And J.D. Vance had already lit the fuse with a grin. He didn't let her finish. Jasmine Crockett had just begun presenting a follow-up case study, a real story of a 10-year-old boy in rural Louisiana who relied on Medicaid to survive chronic asthma. When Vance leaned forward, eyes narrowed, voice cutting through the chamber like a serrated knife. "Miss Crockett does not represent the working class." He snapped. The room shifted, heads turned, cameras tilted slightly, instinctively zooming. "And she represents TikTok wigs and delusional politics." The insult didn't echo, it detonated. The words fell like acid into the room's bloodstream. And even before anyone could react, the weight of it had already settled on every shoulder present. Crockett didn't move, she didn't flinch, but her stillness was louder than fury. It was defiance, coiled and precise. Gasps hissed from the Democratic side, like pressure escaping a cracked valve. One congresswoman rose to her feet, lips parting. In outrage, a second followed, hand raised, ready to object formally. But before either could speak, Vance extended one palm, without turning his head, and shut them down with the same theatrical cruelty. "She's not testifying," he said coldly. "She's performing." That final sentence, "she's performing," struck with surgical intent. It didn't just challenge Jasmine's arguments, it sought to erase her legitimacy entirely, to reduce her existence, her voice, her presence in that room, to nothing more than a stage act, not a public servant, not a policymaker, just a spectacle. But just when the weight of the last insult had barely begun to settle, J.D. Vance leaned forward again, this time not with a smirk, but with sharpened contempt. He knew exactly what he was doing now. This wasn't political theater anymore. It was character assassination broadcast live to a nation on edge. His voice cracked like a rifle shot across marble. "You are not Rosa Parks," he said, each word slicing through the chamber with surgical precision. "You're an Instagram version of a dream that died a long time ago." The impact was immediate, violent. In its stillness, a collective inhale rippled across the rows of witnesses, lawmakers, aides, and journalists. But no one spoke, no one moved. The blow was too precise, too cruel. It wasn't just a personal attack. It was a calculated attempt to sever Jasmine Crockett from the very lineage she stood upon. He hadn't simply dismissed her voice. He had tried to delete her from history, to reduce her presence to a filtered thumbnail of borrowed legacy. and he did it on a record on federal ground under oath. The camera zoomed in instinctively. Centering on Jasmine's face, her expression was frozen not in shock, but in something more primal. It was a silence of someone who had heard this kind of venom before, who had learned to stand in its fire. Without burning her jaw, locked her gaze, didn't shift, not even a single blink betrayed her. She didn't look at Vance. She looked through him, as if the structure, what he represented, was already collapsing in her mind. Around her aide's stiffened fingers curled into fists. One senator's lips moved silently, mouthing words that never made it to air. The entire room sat in a paralysis of moral nausea, unsure if they just witnessed a political exchange or an act of spiritual desecration. The attack wasn't random. It was a culmination. For years, JD Vance had flirted with rhetoric that hollowed out movements he didn't understand. In 2023, during a right-wing podcast appearance, he declared the civil rights movement has been turned into theater. That comment back then had ignited a 48-hour social media firestorm before it faded under newer headlines. But now with Crockett, he had reignited something far larger than he could control. Standing in flesh and blood, he had taken that sentiment and hammered it into her spine. This was not just about disagreeing with policy. This was ideological vandalism. He accused her cosplay of appropriating a dead dream to build a brand. He called her a fraud, not with data, but with disdain. Yet in that split second after his words dropped, Jasmine Crockett did not shatter. She did not react. She refused to react. Her silence was not surrender. It was strategy, the kind of silence that holds back a tidal wave, because the world does not deserve to see it crash just yet. But in her stillness, you could feel the room recalibrate. Lawmakers looked at each other not with confusion, but with rising disbelief. The cameras stayed tight on her face. And across the country, people watching from couches, classrooms, lunch breaks, and hospital waiting rooms knew they had just witnessed something bigger than insult. They saw the exact moment when the mask of respectability slipped and cruelty stood naked at the microphone. And Jasmine was still standing. She did not shout. She did not storm out. She did not meet cruelty with chaos. Jasmine Crockett let the silence speak that day, and it roared to the country. But what came next was not silence at all. It was steel. And it came exactly 48 hours later, not in the form of rebuttal, but in the form of a legal document that sent shock waves through the American political system. At precisely 9:04 in the heart of Washington, D.C., her attorneys walked into the U.S. District Court carrying a binder. The weight of reckoning. The case was filed under federal jurisdiction, Civil Division, Crockett versus Vance. The complaint was 74 pages long, dense, calculated, and brutal in its clarity. It accused Vice President JD Vance of public defamation made with malicious intent rooted in racial and political prejudice, all delivered on a live, nationally televised government broadcast. The filing read not like political theater, but like a forensic report on humiliation, asserting that his language was intended to inflict reputational harm, that his attacks were neither policy critique nor protected speech, and that it crossed a line so clear the Constitution itself had no interest in shielding him. These were not opinions. They were legal blades. At the center of the suit was one number: 100 million. 25 million for direct damages, career injury, personal distress, and targeted public shaming. But the second number was sharper: 75 million in punitive damages.